All right, it's my great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Carl Hart. He's a neuroscientist at Columbia. He's the author of, I gotta say, one of the best books I've read in the past year at least. It's called High Price, a neuroscientist's journey of self-discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs and society. And it opens with you doing some of your lab work up at Columbia, in which you have recruited users of crack cocaine to come into your lab and smoke crack cocaine in your lab and study the effects of that. And we're going to talk about your work in a bit. But before we get to that, a lot of this book is a memoir about someone who grew up in a neighborhood in Miami, an area in Miami that was a working class to poor area, and became a neuroscientist. And you talk about, what I think is interesting is you go back and relive your childhood through the eyes of someone who has studied the way that brains get formed and habits get formed. And you come up with a lot of sort of realizations about what was happening back in that neighborhood in Miami.
Yeah, one of the questions that people oftentimes ask me is, like, how do you come from that neighborhood that you described to becoming the first tenured African-American scientist at Columbia, right? So there are some things that I've learned along the way, and some of the things that could be helpful for folks. Like, there were programs that were in place, summer programs that helped me to move along there. I had strong mentorship. I had strong women in my life who made sure that I stayed on the straight and narrow path as possible, because in the book, as I described, I sold drugs.
Yeah, it's not entirely straight and narrow. It gets a little crooked at times.
Absolutely, absolutely. But those women, those mentors, athletics, high school basketball, all of those things kind of kept me plugged in the mainstream, so I didn't stray too far. And those kind of things were so helpful.
So, one of the themes, I think, of you writing about the early parts of your life in poverty, in a home with several siblings, your parents split up, you live with your grandmother for a while, is kind of talking about, there's this notion in mainstream politics about the kind of pathologies of the underclass, right?
Yes.
You know, the problems of inner city, particularly African-American people of color. And you talk about the culture of that place as having its own internal logic as opposed to being pathologies.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. You know, that's one of the reasons. Let's be clear, I shared a lot of deeply personal information in this book. Yeah. And I didn't do it frivolously. I did it so that people could understand that folks from those types of communities have the same values as people in mainstream. It's just that you are limited in your opportunities, and so you create your own sort of rules, but there is logic and there are rules that governs our behavior.
And that traits, I mean, I think what's really important, what comes through, is that certain traits that are adaptive traits in that environment are maladaptive traits outside of that environment, and vice versa, right?
Absolutely.
That certain traits that you would learn in an affluent community would really create a lot of trouble for you.
Absolutely.
If you went to the neighborhood you grew up in, and it works the other way around.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, oftentimes in the communities in which I grew up from, you knew the people who had the best deals, and sometimes those deals were on items that had been stolen and so forth. And you might purchase this in part because those were the only time or only ways that you could have access to those goods. Now, if you do that in mainstream, you might be liable to being arrested. So that doesn't work in mainstream. There are other rules. But in mainstream, for example, where I'm at Columbia, rather than having direct confrontation when you have a problem with someone, instead there are these indirect ways to kind of check your behavior. Sometimes it's less than being an adult, but in the communities in the hood, it's a direct sort of way of dealing with problems. And so you can't...
Passive aggressiveness. It does not fly.
Absolutely. Passive aggressiveness, that doesn't happen. You deal with problems directly. And so those sorts of things are sometimes inconsistent. And those are the kinds of changes or shifts that one has to make as they move in and out of these different societies.
One of the lines in the book that really stuck with me was you're talking about education. and the value of education. And one of the points you've made, and it's a point that I've read other authors make, and my friend Ta-Nehisi Coates has made this point, is that if you create a system in which even people who obtain education do not get much reward from that, and in fact perversely only find themselves more stifled and more frustrated, then you devalue education, right?
That's right.
And that in the world you were living, you said the adults around us saw school as a quest for a certificate, a stamp of approval you could show around later in life, rather than valuing the process of education itself and the essential critical thinking skills that can be gained from it. They saw school as a means to an end. You even talk about how they even saw too much schooling as liable to just make you a depressed, frustrated, unrealized person because they had seen people who got schooling who weren't able to get out.
That's exactly right. So when you have people who, for example, who have bachelor's degrees, but yet they are working in food service, not that there's anything wrong with food service, but that's certainly not the area in which they got their degree. You start to realize that there are other things at play other than just you getting an education. For example, in mainstream societies, rather than hiring someone, for example, who looked like me in some cases, say, well, that person just wasn't a good fit. You know, so there are things that people say in order to make sure that some certain groups are screened out. And people in the communities in the hood, they know that something else is at play. So it's like, why get this education when it's not going to pay off? When you can instead focus on a trade, a job immediately that's going to pay off. So you understand why people choose certain routes versus other routes. It's not that they don't value education, it's just that they are acutely sensitive to the environmental conditions.
Substances, which is what you would go on to study. They play quite a role in your early life. Your father was a heavy drinker in a very particular way. Describe his relationship to alcohol.
Yeah, so my father was not necessarily a heavy drinker. On the weekends,
Right.
he let go and he drank on the weekends. But during the week, he went to work 5 days a week. He had a house at 26 years old. He did all of these sorts of things that I had not achieved at that age. And so, but he certainly drank heavily on the weekends.
And when he did drink, that would be a precipitating condition for arguments with your mom, sometimes that turned violent.
Yeah, it's certainly. So we're talking the 1970s. You know, this is a real difficult subject for me to talk about, although I put it in the book. But it's one of these things where this was not uncommon behavior where women and men had these sort of physical fights or what have you. It's not something that we approve of today, and not even then, but more people engaged in the behavior then. And so it's kind of difficult for me to talk about it because they are good people, and they were good people. They did their best to take care of their children.
You would go on to go into the armed service, and then you ended up going to college, and you went to graduate school. What was the pull of science and math in particular? You talk a little bit about how from an early age there was some kind of inner peace even that math gave you.
Yeah.
What was the pull of that?
So in the military, one of the things that was really helpful, which was a turning point, is that I spent almost all of my 4 years in the Air Force overseas, and much of that time was spent in England. And one of the things about the British was that they were not bashful at criticizing the Americans in terms of our race relations in the country. And so much of my reality that I had seen growing up in the hood about racism and those sorts of things, it was corroborated in England. And that was eye-opening to me because it wasn't corroborated in this country. And I met mentors and people who encouraged me to go to college in places like not only England, but even earlier in Japan. But in England, I really got this reinforcement from education. And I was told that I was good. I could think. I was studying psychology.
What did it feel like when people started telling you that?
When people started to tell me, then I felt like I could do it. I felt just like it was on the basketball court. I was good at it. And then I felt like I could actually maybe make a living at this sort of thing. But my first sort of goal was to be able to contribute to the community, get a degree in order to counsel young kids who had grown up like I had grown up. In part, that's why I wrote the book so personally, so people could see that you can make mistakes and you can still make it in this society. You can still contribute to this society, even having made those mistakes. But in England, is where my education really got started and turned on. I really got turned on to education in England.